I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit today about one of my experiences in wilderness making a mistake. I'm going to grab the cord because I'm really feeling Judy Garland energy today. So, thank you. Okay. Um, so I really love hiking. It's something that I enjoy doing. It's something that I'm not amazing at, but it's something that brings me a lot of joy. And as a teacher, it's what I can afford. So when it comes time for vacation, that's what I'm out to do. And every year in the fall, on our fall break, that's what I do. I go out with one of my friends and we go to somewhere else in North America and we hike. Some of these hikes go better than others. And so I want to talk to you a little bit today about one of those particular hikes. In 2017, I was scrolling through Instagram. Isn't that how every great story starts? I was scrolling through Instagram and I came across this really cool picture and I said, I want to do that. I want to hike that. And it was a picture of Zion National Park. And there was like all these cool different things that were coming up, the Angel's Landing hike, and one of them that really stood out to me was the Narrows, Zion Narrows. And so the Narrows are like these, oh gosh, it's a valley, like a canyon, and the walls are super tall, like 1,000 feet tall, and there's water in it. And I said that looks cool, like I want to do that. So I got my friend. We went ahead, we went out there, and we didn't exactly do the most research. So the only thing that we knew was that we wanted to get there early, right? In general, usually good advice. So we arrived super early to Zion National Park, and when we get there, we see that there's this huge line for the supply area, like hiking sticks, stuff like that. And we're like, we're in our early 20s, like we don't need that. We're fine. And the line for the bus, like no one was there. No one was there, and we're thinking, we're amazing. We're brilliant. So we run over to the bus line. We get on the bus, head out to the trail, and we're really feeling ourselves. Now, I did want to show you. See, now, my friend didn't know I'd be giving this talk one day, so he focused on the canyon and not me. So I circled myself. You can see me. It's me, Zion. It's really beautiful, right? And the first part of the hike was just like this, and I was feeling my Instagram fantasy. I said, okay. I was really feeling the hike, really loving it. It was beautiful. I was feeling inspired. I said, this is awesome. And then came a part of the hike where the water got a little taller. Anyone who's familiar with Zion National Park knows that the water gets pretty tall, and those people are wearing the right equipment. I was not. So at one point, I took a wrong step, and I sunk not just to my waist. I sunk all the way to my upper chest in water. I was wearing some cute, not great hiking boots, and some tight, skinny jeans, and it was not a good vibe. It was not a good fit. I was very cold, and I was very miserable. And while I was really feeling all of this beautiful energy and mistakes, frustration, annoyance with myself, I see this young girl, 8 or 9, basically walking on water. And she has a walking stick. Because one of the reasons you get a walking stick for Zion is because you feel out how deep the water is. I didn't know that. So this girl is basically walking on water next to me while I'm completely submerged, miserable, so cold, so very cold. It was October, and I was so frustrated, but also so impressed, right, with this little kid who was just living their dream, living their life. And when we ended up finishing the hike, I remember my friend and I being so annoyed and kind of mad, right? But also laughing so hard because this is ridiculous, right? We were not prepared. We were not ready for this. It was definitely a mistake not to have gone to the rental, not to have gotten some of this equipment, not to have done our reading ahead of time. All of those were mistakes, but it was also a really beautiful and happy mistake because it's the hike we talk the most about. And mistakes do provide one of the most powerful learning experiences that we have as humans. I'm a teacher. I've taught for 6 years, middle school science at Harshman Middle School, which is just down the street. Some of you might have even passed it on your way here today. And middle school is mistake central, right? Because none of you were your best self in middle school, okay? None of you can look back on your life and say oh, when I really had it together, 7th grade. I was my kindest self. I was my most empathetic self in 7th grade. You weren't. So middle school is just mistake central, both for the students as well as the adults, right? Because when you're around that energy, you do take some of that on. So Middle schools are mistake central, and so as a teacher, you get to see students navigating this really mistake-prone part of their lives. But that's also really cool and beautiful because we know that mistakes are a part of how you learn. And so our goal as educators is to create an environment where people feel safe and comfortable making those mistakes. What we want for our students, what we want for everyone, right, is that they're comfortable taking risks. They're going to help them grow. They're going to help them change. They're going to help them be more complete, competent, empathetic, kind people. Now, there's a little bit of like science behind this, and as a science teacher, I gotta tell you. So there has been a bunch of research studies out of like Caltech, USC, Sanyang even, and what those studies have shown is that we learn more from our mistakes than we do our successes. That seems like a little obvious, okay, but I gotta quantify this. So what they found in these studies was that when these students, the test subjects were taking these tests, specifically most of them were math related, and what they found was that every single time somebody made a mistake, synapses were firing between their cells. But that only happened some of the time when they would get the questions correct. Now here's why that like matters. When synapses fire between cells, and I'm going to kind of super oversimplify this because my husband told me if I talk too much about this, I lose everyone, and nobody likes that. So when synapses fire right between your cells, that's two cells communicating to each other. And if you want to think of it this way, what a single cell could tackle by itself is not as great as what multiple cells could tackle, right? So when you've got cells communicating, when you've got synapses firing, your brain's capable of tackling more complicated issues, more complex problems, right? More dynamic thinking. So when you get something wrong, your brain starts to have those synapses firing, and so then your brain becomes more capable of tackling bigger and more dynamic challenges. So we literally learn more from our mistakes than we do our successes. Now that doesn't mean if you got 2 plus 2 wrong, right, that now suddenly you know the right answer to that. That's not what that means. But what it means is that you might get 2 plus 2 wrong, but as you're thinking about that, you're now capable of tackling more complicated problems. And this goes outside of just math, right? We weren't just measuring somebody's feelings about like, oh, I feel like I learned something. No, it was literally watching the brain development work. Now, I don't know, and most scientists don't know exactly why that is, right? If I knew why that was the case, I'd have like a Nobel Peace Prize, I'd have a fully funded classroom, things would be very different for me right now. But what our best guess is that when your cells are communicating, and you have more communication, more synapses firing, your brain is able to then tackle these more dynamic and complicated problems because they're communicating to each other. So when we think through how our mistakes influence us and how our mistakes are going to, oh, that's me as a teacher. Yay. How our mistakes are going to influence us, how our mistakes are going to help us be better people, it literally comes down to our brains being capable of more dynamic thinking, which is awesome, right? Also helps reframe it a little bit. You can think of like every mistake that you made this week as being like, my brain's bigger. Literally, your brain is bigger now. Now, even knowing this, and even though I'm not the first person to tell you mistakes matter. I hope I'm not, right? You've had teachers tell you this. You've maybe heard a TED Talk. You've heard a podcast, a magazine, whatever, right? Like you've heard that mistakes matter before. So the real question is why are we so afraid of them then, right? Why even this morning I was like, oh, I hope I don't make a mistake today, right? Like I didn't want to, screw up this speech too bad. I'm doing okay, right, Caitlin? Okay, thank you. Right, like we're so afraid of making mistakes. And so I was kind of curious as why that is. And as a teacher, right, like why, even though we know this is so important, why we are so afraid of mistakes. When I first entered the classroom, I was terrified of mistakes. Even though I understood on some level my students were going to need to make mistakes in order to grow, I was terrified of the mistakes I would make. And I was afraid, naively and misguidedly so, of the mistakes my students would make, right? When I gave them a quiz or a test, I didn't want them to make a mistake. I wanted them to do well on it, despite the fact that them making mistakes on complicated problem solving would help them in the long run. There's this sort of immediate short-term fear of our mistakes. And a lot of that has to do with our own perception. A lot of it has to do with in 2022, a lot of mistakes are memorialized, right? Like, if you make a mistake in an email or on social media, it lives. It lives. And it's recorded. And so because of that, right, that's some of why we're afraid of mistakes. But I also think the thing we don't talk enough about is that while mistakes are an important part of our growth and our journeys, I don't think we talk enough about that. That doesn't absolve us of the consequences of our mistakes. So when I make a mistake in my classroom, right, that mistake in reflecting is still going to make me, a better teacher in the long run. But that mistake might have still had very real consequences and a negative impact on the students that I'm teaching. So how do you navigate the fact that we know mistakes are this important part of growing and being better humans, while also struggling and navigating, but that mistake might have hurt someone? And that's the gray area that I sort of want to live in right now for the next, however much time they give me on this mic. When we're thinking through how our actions impact others, we have to be thinking about the grace we give ourselves, but also remembering where we're coming from and where we're going. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is that when I make a mistake, I need to both think about how I'm going to move forward, right? Who is the person I'm trying to become, and where does this mistake fit into that? But not forgetting how that action might have impacted somebody else. And while I can seek to remedy that, and I should seek to remedy that mistake and its impact, for example, as a teacher, if I've made a mistake, I might conference with the student, right? If it was like me snapping at a kid, right? I might conference with the student. If it's a whole lesson that I taught wrong, not that that's ever happened, then maybe that means the next day saying, hey, everyone, I was wrong, and reteaching that lesson. So those are, kind of simpler ways. But what about situations in which you've maybe caused a person harm outside of, right, like just your job, right? Maybe even that mistake was somebody that you won't ever see again, a mistake that you made in passing. I also serve and sometimes bartend, right? And so sometimes the mistakes I make, I'm not going to see that person again, right? So you have to both think about, okay, how is this going to help me be better? But also think about how it impacted somebody else. And when you can, seek to remedy. But when you can't, when you don't see that person again, when you don't, right, you don't have that opportunity to make it right, or maybe that person has been hurt to the point where they're not interested, right? They don't owe you that. They don't owe you any sort of absolvement from the mistakes that you made. That doesn't mean sit in that pain forever, right? Like for you, right? But it does mean recognizing that you did cause it and moving on. Not moving on as in forgetting, but moving on saying, okay, how are the actions that I'm going to be living out today represent a better person that's capable of more complex thinking about this than I was when I made that mistake? Especially in my role as a server, that happens a lot because of most of the people that I interact with that I might make a mistake with, I'm not going to see again. And so I have to think about, okay, how is the server, right, the person that I am today, going to do better? Going to make sure that, not that I'm not making mistakes, but that I'm going to try to make sure that I'm remedying when I can. So maybe it's closing that loop, not letting it sit as long, even though that can be such a scary thing. So saying, oh, I made this mistake, I could, wait for a while before addressing it, or maybe I just need to have this conversation now. So I want to challenge you to think about how you are closing that loop, and when you can remedying the mistake, when you can trying to address it, but also when you can't, thinking through how are your actions today representing you as a better person. One of my favorite quotes that I wanted to make sure I talked about, of course, was Maya Angelou and how that fits into all this, right? Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And really, Maya Angelou said much more succinctly what it's taking me and took me all of this time to realize. This idea that when we make mistakes, when we hurt people, we have to recognize that and then do better. And doing better, while important, doesn't absolve us of the pain or the consequences of those previous actions. So let's go back to this, because if we sit on Maya too long, you'll all realize, wait, why is he even still talking? Maya said all this already. Why are we? When I was 22 years old, right, I don't blame 22-year-old Jack or 18-year-old Jack for the mistakes that he made, right? I don't blame him for those. but I acknowledge that those mistakes happen, and it's important that I think through why and how those mistakes happened. So when I started in teaching, I used to feel like every time a student made a mistake that somehow was representing some like flaw on my part, right? Like that was like, oh, that was me. That was my fault. Like somehow something I did like caused this mistake. And because I was looking at mistakes as this really bad thing, I couldn't help but feel this sort of impossibly heavy burden, right? That every action, every mistake I made was somehow ruining the future of America. That's how much impact I thought I had. Now I realize I have very little. But at the time, I thought, I was like, oh my gosh, like you are ruining a whole generation. Every single mistake that you're making in front of these students is somehow going to have this ripple effect. It's going to somehow cause these students to go on and have their own fears like compound. And that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot to feel. But everyone does this, right? Even outside of teaching, a lot of us, when we make these mistakes and they impact somebody else, we do start to sort of like self-attack in ways that make us think, oh my gosh, like I shouldn't have done that. I who knows what kind of long-term effects there are. But that self-attacking is actually ourselves trying to distract from making it right. So we have to shift from attacking ourselves, right? Attacking like the sort of the shame part of it and focusing towards, okay, what are you going to do differently? Because once you start to make that shift, you realize that, okay, well, maybe this isn't the end of the world, right? But two, moving forward in a better way is going to be better for everyone. So instead of wearing this heavily impossible, burden on my shoulders of like, oh, all of my students' test scores are 100% a reflection of me as a human and my self-worth. No. But instead of focusing on that, thinking about the choices I am making with kids, right? Where am I putting my energy working with my students? How are my students collaborating and like working together through problem solving, right? Things that are objectively much more important in the real world than sitting for 2-3 hours at a test. So thinking about how we make that shift from the self-attackings, from the shame, into the actions and what we're doing to actually represent someone who has learned, someone who's reflected from their growth is really important. Outside of teaching, I mentioned that I'm a server, and in serving, people process your mistakes very differently. You would think that, like, objectively, between teaching and serving, you'd think the stakes are a lot lower, right? This is not like a child's like future involved. This is your meal at Bodhi, but people, woo, yikes. People have a lot of feelings, right? When, oh, like this is too spicy. This isn't spicy enough. It's like, it says that on the menu. But I think where the interesting perspective is in there, right, is in those micro examples that like I've learned a lot in serving of how people process other people's mistakes. So separate from their own mistakes, how people react, one, tells you a lot about who they are. But two, it also reinforces the idea that society has around mistakes. Society really villainizes mistakes and cultures, which is, again, so bizarre because anyone who's ever read or dived into anything like self-help related, right? All of these things talk about taking risks, right? Taking chances. So on the one hand, you have this like pretty well-informed body of work telling us like, yeah, mistakes are good. It's part of the process. Yeah. And then you have the lived experience, right? And the society expectations around how awful mistakes are and how terrible they are. If a singer, right, is like doing well, killing the game, and then has like one album that doesn't hit number one, it's like, oh, they're in their flop era, right? Like we latch on to these mistakes. And in serving, again, you'd think lower risk. You maybe bring the wrong, a food runner brings the wrong plate to a table. Okay, well, let's get you in the right, like it's not. And up in arms, where's my food? How do you not understand this isn't my food? It's like, I'm not even your server. Like, I'm just like trying to help out, like running a plate to you. But again, it has to do with this way that society has ingrained in us this desire of like perfection and this mistake-free reality that's impossible. That's not reality, right? But that's what we see in culture and society is this idea of like who we are in this perfect world. And of course, I thought about like just talking about social media and the way but I think that like that's been done, right? We know We know how social media plays into this, but it really does go beyond that. Even if you look at our news, right? Any mistake that an individual makes, and maybe a quick caveat I should offer, obviously there are very real mistakes that have very big consequences, right? So this is not what this is about right now. But even when you think, I say that because I'm about to mention like politics. And so again, there are levels of mistakes, people. But even when you consider smaller mistakes, right, that a politician might make, the way in which we blow up and that we focus and that we villainize individuals based on those mistakes becomes so ingrained in the fabric of our like culture and society. And so what makes it even more challenging, I think, as people involved in the creative community, is if that's how you see mistakes and risks treated at even levels of like from school to the restaurant to government, then it becomes, I think, really scary. And I think we internalize that fear of taking real risks and chances. Because what will those mistakes say about us? Or what will other people say about those perceived mistakes? Fun fact, I don't have a lot of solutions today. It's mostly me talking. But I guess what I want to make sure that we understand is that this idea of the culture that exists around mistakes and changing that culture comes through two main things. One is vulnerability. It's admitting not just that you've made mistakes, but taking time to think about how your mistakes impact other people. That doesn't mean dwell in the pain so that you have a reason to feel pity and not move on, right? And not be a better person. But really thinking about, okay, I'll give an example. Vulnerability. I was supposed to send out a letter to families about an event we were doing at our school. I did not. If my principal's watching, I'm so sorry. When I made the mistake, maybe two people, right, like knew that I was supposed to do that. So the first thing I started to do when I made the mistake was like, oh my gosh, like damage control, right? Like how many people knew I was supposed to do this? Like what can I? And then when I stopped to go, okay, who is impacted by this? Who is going to feel the consequence of this action? In that situation, there was going to be families who were impacted. Now the families didn't know they were supposed to get the letter. So like in one way I could just, okay, like yes, that's a real consequences of this action, but like what are the ripple effects of that, right? Like what was the event for? What was the event about that they were supposed to get information for? And when I started to unpack it, it made me realize, oh, well, one, there's another way I can get this information to my families. Two, the people that I need to like own up to this, like might have other ways to get in contact with families, right? Or to disseminate this information. And so in talking to like our family engagement coordinator, I'm saying, hey, full T, I didn't do this. Like I totally forgot, like the end of the school year was a madhouse. And I didn't send out this letter to like my students. And they said, oh, well, like, okay, then great. We'll just send out a postcard tomorrow. Like it's not. But if I had only focused, right, on, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. Oh my gosh, this like internalized shame of like what went with that mistake and not wanting to deal with it. One, the family still would have never gotten the information, right? So one, by acknowledging and thinking through, okay, like what was this mistake? How did it impact? And then reaching out and I'm saying like, I didn't do this. The reality was there was a very simple solution. Not all of our mistakes are going to have simple solutions. Some of our mistakes are going to have much deeper consequences and also have much more complicated problems to solve. But think back to what I talked about in terms of our brain. The more complicated the problem that we make the mistake in, the more brain growth that's happening. The more that we're going to be able to push through, the more that we're going to be able to tackle those more dynamic problems, to tackle more dynamic thinking and problem solving. And so in reality, what we start to think of, oh my gosh, this mistake was huge and it's impossible to figure it out. In reality, those bigger mistakes are going to, in the long run, help us to do the more dynamic thinking needed to problem solve those mistakes. So let's go back to my classroom, my safe place. When I think through how I navigate mistakes in the classroom and thinking through like where I'm going to be moving forward, it also means reevaluating how I teach and making sure that students are feeling comfortable and that the students experience a middle school where they feel supported in making mistakes. Even when those mistakes might reflect poorly on me, right, by objective measures. But what is the best long-term for my students' thinking, for their development? It's going to be making sure that they do feel comfortable with those mistakes, that they feel comfortable navigating those mistakes and moving forward. And how are we all going to move forward today thinking through how our mistakes are going to impact us in terms of making us more dynamic, critical thinkers, but also not absolving ourselves from the consequences that those actions or those mistakes might have caused. So mistakes are a super powerful learning experience, but only if we reflect and we make it that way. I hope you all go out and make wonderful life choices. Thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it.